Hello, everyone. Steve Parr here, Director of the Gwinnett Metro Baptist Network and Love Ministry. And today I'm going to share about one of my passions with children's leaders. And we're going to talk about what it is that keeps kids connected to church into their adult lives from my work called Why They Stay. But again, specifically talk about implications for children's leaders and children's workers. We have today with us Caroline Dale from Ivy Creek Baptist Church, children's coordinator there, and the executive pastor from Bethany Baptist Church in Snellville, Georgia, Rick Kirkland. Hey guys, how y'all doing? Good to see you today. Glad to have you with us. So if you'll be patient a moment, everyone, I'm going to share my screen and I'll share with you a PowerPoint. And once we get up on that, we will be ready to go. Here we go. Now, if you're not familiar with this already, a few years ago, I was really troubled by a couple of things. One would be the number of young adults that are leaving our churches, but also, quite frankly, I was struggling at that time with one of my three daughters who was an adult and was not in church. And I always beat myself up over, where did I go wrong here? And one thing I want to say to you that at the outset, if you're a parent, and you probably are, those of you who work with parents, is I learned you can do everything right as a parent and things can still go wrong. So let's remember that. And it's not that I did everything right. I certainly made mistakes, but I realized a lot of what happened to my daughter was not necessarily parenting issues. And we may catch some of those in here. But I also say to parents that you can do everything wrong and it's not going to go right. And the good news about this material, it shows you what those right things are that we do as parents and those things that we do certainly in the church. So keeping kids connected to church for life is what we're focusing on here. Now, Proverbs 27:23 says, know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds. And for those of us in ministry working with children and boys and girls, we're trying to make investments that will last for a lifetime and get them deeply rooted. And so this is a verse I think about as I want to follow those that I have poured my life into, not just over the course of the year, but really throughout their lives to see that what God has done has taken root in their lives. So if you don't already know about this, a few years back, I endeavored with a friend of mine named Tom Christ to do a national study of young adults. And what these young adults had in common was they grew up attending church. They were aged 26 to 39. And we needed in this survey to survey 1,088. There is a science to it. And the reason we chose that age group 26 to 39, we were wanting to look at younger adults. And while there's generational changes, those who were more closely affiliated with children and teens of today. And also they had grown up in church. Now, when we did our survey of those who had grown up in church, not all were still in church. A lot were out. And that was good, not good that they were out of church. It was good that we had their information because we could contrast what we learned from those who grew up in church and stayed there versus those who grew up in church and had left the church. So again, instead of studying why people are leaving, we did just the opposite. We studied people to find out what kept them connected to church into their adult lives. And we ended up with 1,393 surveys. And this was not a Baptist survey. It was a multi-denominational. And also it was a national survey, coast to coast and Canada. So it gave us some great information. And the good thing about it is we uncovered 15 huge issues that affect the likelihood that your children or those who are in your children's ministry will still be in church as adults. There were 15 huge issues and there were 10 smaller issues. So sometimes when I'm speaking, I call these anchors, 15 anchors. And I think of the parable of the soils, how the sower went forth to sow his seed and some fell on, remember, the shallow ground and some of the thorns choked it out, but some fell on fertile ground. Well, you and I know only God saves, we can't save. It's a work of the Holy Spirit. But in that parable, the seed is the word of God and the soil is the heart of man. And the sower is the parent or it's the pastor. So what are those things we do that, impact our children? We found there are things that you do as a parent or a pastor or a children's leader that make a huge difference in the likelihood that your children will still be in church. And while there's 15 of these things, it's not necessary that all 15 are true, But the more of these things that are true of your child or those children who grew up in your church, the more likely they'll be in church as adults. And the great thing about this, instead of looking at why they're leaving, but looking at why they're staying, is it is very proactive. It shows you things we can tangibly do, and they're certainly biblically rooted. And I'm going to just summarize these quickly, not all 15, just the ones specifically that have implications for our children's leaders. Now, if you want to know more, there's a book called Why They Stay, but you can also go to steveparr.net, and you will find there under the media tab where I'm preaching sermons on this subject in a church, where I'm speaking to leaders in a conference in Louisiana. Or you can go to the Why They Stay tab, and there are 8 hours of videos in 30-minute segments designed for parents where I cover this very thoroughly. So you're getting just a snapshot today. So go to steveparr.net. You can also find out how to purchase the book there if you have any interest. But the information on the website is absolutely free. There's no cost for those videos, and you can use those. So let's look at the issues that were specifically related to children and children's leaders. One is this: the influence of a strong marriage. And it was hands down that those who grew up in church and are still there said, in essence, my mom and dad loved each other when I was growing up. And there was a direct correlation between healthy marriages and children still being in church when they're 25, 35, and 45. Now, this is interesting. While I'm a big fan of Vacation Bible School and children's ministry and devotions, we should do all those things. We need to help parents to understand something. Their marriage is literally having an impact on the likelihood that faith will take root in their child. Now, when I speak on this subject, I will say this. I'm saying it without any judgment, without any condemnation for those who have experienced struggling marriages or broken marriages. But the reality is, one of the best investments you can make in the spiritual health of your child is to love the other parent. And that's why in the book I entitled the chapter, Daddy, Do You Love Mama? Because one of the best things I can do for my children, and my children are grown now, that affects their spiritual walk and the likelihood they'll be in church as an adult, is for me to love their mother. Now, teens whose parents have a healthy marriage are also much more inclined to be in church as adults. Now, I told you there's no judgment or condemnation, but being intellectually honest, just a couple of notes about broken marriages. Relationship with both parents is very important, mom and dad, meaning where there has been a dissolution of the marriage, it's important that you continue, as difficult as it may be, to foster a healthy relationship between your child and the other parent. That remains critical. And I also say this: when a divorce did happen during high school, the numbers went off the chart in terms of the effect that it had on the spirituality or the spiritual connection of that young adult or that child, teenager, however you want to characterize that. So I want to say to Rick and Caroline and others who are watching this, one thing that you can do as a children's leader is this, and I'm going to ask it in the form of a question. What are you doing to strengthen marriages in your church? Because the more you're doing to strengthen and pour into the marriages in your church, the more you're doing to help the faith of the children who are in your ministry to take root. So make investment in marriages, yours and others, of course. And again, I'll be glad to discuss that more with you as we get to the conclusion here. But here's the second thing we discovered that has big implications for you as a children's leader. It was the influence of the disciplinary style of the parents. And here's what we discovered. Young adults strayed when they experienced abuse, and that's probably a no-brainer there. If a child experienced physical or, God forbid, sexual abuse, their view of God is so often damaged, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult, to come back from. It really robs them of faith in many ways. On the other hand, you have the parent who is just totally hands off, very lenient in their child rearing. Here's what's interesting. We found the child whose parents were very lenient and hands off in their parenting. They were as likely, though it's not nearly as egregious, they were as likely to be out of church as an adult as one who was abused as a child. And so we asked in the survey, were your parents abusive? Or were they very strict? Were they somewhat strict? Were they balanced? Were they somewhat lenient? Were they very lenient? Were they just hands off? And it was like a bell curve. And the more balanced they were, the more likely they were in church. There is a text you can draw from in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1-4, where it talks about bringing your children up in the discipline or the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And those statements are not redundant. It's two different things. The nurture is the fawning over your child and the loving on them, telling them how great they are. And then the admonition is the discipline. You're grounded. You can't have another cookie. You cannot stay on your phone tonight. You can't watch TV. So it's doing both, because if you discipline without the nurture, you'll have a frustrated child. And it says, fathers, don't provoke your children to anger in that text. If you always loving on them and spoiling them like a grandparent does, but as a parent, if you do that, you'll have a spoiled child, So in one, you have a frustrated child, the other, you have a spoiled child. And so we find that those who are still in church, they had a very disciplined, their parents, a very disciplined lifestyle. So that begs a question again for you as children's leaders, okay? And this has nothing to do with children directly, but what are you doing to help parents to improve in their disciplinary style with their children? Because I will tell you, as a parent with 3 grown daughters, I was always chasing it. My compliant child, it was quite easy. My strong-willed child, it was always a battle, and struggled with it a whole lot. A lot of parents are struggling. And then today you add new dynamics with social media and the World Wide Web and the access that not only people have to your child, but the access that your children have to people. I was in a very closed community growing up, a small one red light town. But today a child has access to things all over the world, and the whole world has access to your child. So that's adding other dynamics to discipline. So what are you doing, again, to help your parents? That was another issue. Here's a third issue we saw, which is interesting. It was the influence of a post-conversion baptism. Now, if you're perchance watching this, and most of my friends watching are Southern Baptist leaders, if you're outside of Southern Baptist life, I want you to know this was a very objective survey. We weren't fishing, we were curious, and this is just where it landed. There was no doubt about it. We discovered that young adults, well, listen, is 400% more likely to have strayed if they had never been baptized. So baptism is important, first of all, okay? But they were 16% more likely to be in church if they had a post-conversion baptism versus a pre-conversion baptism. So you see two things there. Baptism is important. And then you see that post-conversion baptism does make a difference. Now, 16% in a survey like this is a huge number when you look at the numbers of people that we did. When you're looking, you've probably heard of in surveys, margins of error of 3 or 4%. Ours was less than 4%, meaning if something was 3 or 4% different, you just throw it out and wouldn't even worry about it. But when something gets to be 15 and 20 and 30 or 400% different, you really begin to pay attention. So post-conversion baptism is important. Now, I will say this. I've got friends who were baptized as infants. And here's what I would say to them. God bless your parents. Your parents are to be commended for loving you and wanting to instill faith in you. But we have to also be honest enough to ask, I think I can make the theological argument, but also very practically, it's a reality that those who experience post-conversion baptism are more likely to be in church as adults, and those who are baptized as infants or experience pre-conversion baptism. So again, here's the question for us as children's leaders, not only as we share the gospel, never to be manipulative or coercive, but as we lay the gospel in front of boys and girls very carefully, and as they respond back, what are we doing to assist with the baptism issue? Now, one thing we did discover about those who were still in church as adults, they came to know Christ when they were young, but not too young. As a matter of fact, there was, again, a major difference once, if someone verbalized their conversion experience as being something that happened prior to 5 years of age. There's a huge difference versus happening at 5 and 6 and 7 years of age, much less at 9 and 10 and 11. And then after age 14, again, it very rarely happens, but it did not seem to stick if it's prior. And again, I know once a person comes to know Christ, they cannot lose their salvation, but we wonder if it ever genuinely happened. Now, I can give testimonies where people came to faith at very early ages, and you probably can too, but just to be aware that we did find that they came to know Christ when they were young, but not too young, okay? And here's another thing that is gold for you as a children's leader, and it was the influence of serving. Here's what we discovered. Those who grew up in church and were still there as adults, their mom and dad served in the church when they were growing up. And two key words here. First, the word and. Who served? Mom and dad served in the church. Not just mom, not just dad. They both served. Another key word is the word, served. I didn't say mom and dad attended the church when they were growing up. I said mom and dad served in the church. You see, because you can attend and not serve. But if you serve, you must of necessity attend. It kind of takes care of all of it. Those who had parents that served in church were 50% more likely to be in church as adults than those whose moms and dads did not serve in church when they were younger. Now, I want to give you something else as a children's leader that's not part of my work, not part of my book. Something I did post-writing, I found out as I put on my small groups Sunday school hat. And with my work of knowing how many leaders you need in preschool, how many leaders you need with your children, having 2 per age group, how many you need in students, and even with college. And here's what I discovered. Every parent who gives birth to a child, if they do not give 7 of the next 21 years, that's 1 out of every 3, to either preschool, children, youth, or college ministry, then that is the reason your church is short-staffed right now. Let me say it another way. If every parent who gave birth to a child would give 1 out of every 3 years, 7 out of 21, to work in the preschool or with the children or with the students or with the college students, you would never be looking for a children's worker again. Do you believe that? Isn't that crazy? So this is something good to share with our parents, not again to manipulate them, but to say, here's the reality. When you're serving, you're also investing in the faith of your child. It has more credibility with them. And there's no doubt the parent is the #1 influence in their life in shaping their faith. And you can be a person of faith and they could stray. I understand that. And we all know people who grew up with parents who were not Christians and they're serving Christ. But those are the exceptions, not the rules. Typically, parents who are loving God with all the heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that's epitomized by, among other things, they're serving Christ. So you can use this as a point to encourage your parents to invest themselves. Here's another issue, and this was one of my 2 biggest surprises in the research. As a matter of fact, on this one in particular, it changed my mind, literally. And it was the influence of worshiping together as a family. We discovered those who grew up in church and were still there as adults, listen to this, they worshiped alongside their parents when they were growing up. Now, this is going to rub some people the wrong way a little bit, but just relax. I'm just reporting what we discovered. And let me say here, we're not talking about preschoolers, not talking about your 2-year-olds or your bed babies. We are talking about elementary age. What we discovered was that those who worshiped alongside their parents in elementary school and in high school were more likely to be in church than those who were with children's worship experiences. Again, it was significant. They were 37% more likely to still be in church as adults if they grew up regularly attending worship services that did not separate them from their parents. Now, don't panic if you've got a children's worship experience. Again, not being condemning, not judging or anything, but we've got to step back for a second and begin to ask ourselves, again, what is the best approach here? There's a lot I can say about this. If you want to rewind, I will in just a moment and talk to you some more about the dynamics there. But in summary is this. It's not having the children coming forward for a children's worship experience with the pastor or a children's leader in front of everybody. That's not what we're talking about. This would not be where the children come to what we call a big church. That's not what we're talking about. It's not where children come and they worship alongside their parents and then they step out for a children's sermon, maybe in another room. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where a parent drops off their child at 9:30. The child goes to Bible study, Sunday school, whatever you call it. From there, the adults go to an adult worship service. The boys and girls go to a children's worship experience. And the parents pick them up at 12:30 or whatever. They haven't been with them all morning long. One thing that's happening to connect to the previous point, those children are not seeing their parents serving through worship, singing in the choir, the praise team, taking up the offering, opening the scripture and following along, giving of their tithes and offerings. So there's a lot of dynamics there. So this was very interesting, and I'm just telling you what we learned. So I'm not saying go and change everything tomorrow, but you do need to evaluate how you manage that dynamic on Sundays, because we did find a big difference. One little anecdotal story I'll tell you real quick. When my wife and I dropped my baby girl off to college a few years back, we were driving away, and as you can imagine, we were kind of reflecting on our baby girl now being in college. And I told my wife, I said, one thing I regret that we did not worship together more, and I mean worship in church together more as a family, because I was in a church where we were always separated, and I can't recapture that. There's some things I've done to make up for that in their adult lives, but I just want to say I wish we'd done that more when they were teenagers. I did hear of one church who had come across this information. One step they took, they had a full-blown children's worship, did it great, by the way, as most people do. But they determined to take the first Sunday of the month and make it Family First Sunday. And so they would bring all the children into worship, at least the first Sunday of the month, to worship alongside their parents. And they continued on with the other. I think that is at least a step towards, getting more interaction with parents and children during worship. All right, let's do a couple more here. And here was the other big surprise. I've never seen this anywhere else in any other research. And it was a good surprise, but it was the influence of the pastoral connection. And let me tell you what we discovered. We discovered that those boys and girls who are now adults who are still in church, they overwhelmingly said, I loved my pastor when I was growing up. Now listen carefully. I didn't say, I love my pastor. They said, I loved my pastor as I was growing up. They were much more likely to be in church, twice as likely. It's crazy. 90% more likely to be in church still if they said they loved their pastor or liked their pastor growing up. But here was another interesting dynamic. We asked, how many pastors did you have growing up? And, it's interesting. The more pastors one had growing up, guess what? The less likely they were in church. I'm not talking about staff members, I'm talking about senior pastors. So it's important, if they had one or two and no pastor stays forever, there was a big difference. But once they had a third pastor, much less a fourth, fifth, sixth, the more pastors they had, the less likely they were in church. So for the pastor, it says something to them, but for the layperson, it says something to them. But for the children's director, it says something to you. What are you doing to foster good relationship between the pastor and the boys and girls in your church? And so think about that, and I'll be glad to discuss that with you also in just a few moments. One other thing here that you'll appreciate was the influence of children's ministry. This was not one of the big issues, but you'll appreciate this. Though the correlation was small, there was a connection between the likelihood of being in church as an adult and stating that their church had significant activities for children in their church when they were growing up. Now, you've got to separate this from the children's worship issue for a moment. Children's ministry is a big umbrella under which many things take place, perhaps including children's worship. So whether or not their church had a children's worship experience, they all had a lot of children's activities when the boys and girls were growing up. And the less, if you go to a church and it may or not be small, but probably is, where there's nothing for the children, they were very unlikely to be in church. So doing things with your kids, from Bible study opportunities, vacation Bible school, those type things, and then just the fellowship activities, they do have an impact, because you know how it is when your children, those activities seem larger than life, and you hold on to them for a long time, and they give you just a pleasantness about your experience when you have those good times with your peers and other adults as a child. So I just want to encourage you as a children's leader, what you're doing is making a difference with those boys and girls. I want to remind you, on steveparr.net, there's a 10-week video series for parents you can use. It is free. Go check it out under the Why They Stay tab. Now I'm going to come off my screen share for a moment. Caroline, I noticed you're got your video muted. If you don't mind joining us back for a moment, thank you. I'm going to see here if you guys want to rewind, Rick or Caroline. First of all, let me ask you a question. Rick, what was the biggest surprise to you out of those issues that I brought up? And don't forget to unmute your microphone, buddy.
I guess it should not have been a surprise, but as I was listening to what you were saying, the one thing that kept coming to mind was stability in all areas. Stability in the parents, the marriage, stability in the church with the long tenured pastors,
Yes.
and it was just the whole family atmosphere and everything. The children would feel comfortable in that atmosphere, and they would feel safe and supported. And so that's just kind of where I'm at right now.
Well, brother, that is an astute observation, and that's the first time I've used the word astute in a long time. So that is a that's smart. You're right, and
It's
that
not one that gets used often with me, I can assure you. You know that.
yeah. So yeah, that the stability at home, stability at church, and I want to tell you one thing that I discovered, and I preach on this subject, why young adults are walking away, and I say I can bring it down to one word. It's the word HURT, hurt. If I can summarize why adults who are not in church, they're because of family or church situations. So the way we manage church situations, there's going to be conflict in the family. They didn't say they had an absence of conflict. And by the way, we noted there was not an absence of conflict in the church, but the way the conflict was managed in the marriage or in the church was not. It didn't just blow them up, so to speak. It's like the house built on the sand versus the one on the rock. It made a huge difference. Okay, Carolyn, how about you? For you, what was the biggest surprise for you?
I don't know, probably, I mean, I think I had heard your comment about, I think you had discussed one of the last things about parents giving 7 of 21 years. But just the influence of both parents serving in church. And I mean, and it makes perfect sense that the more investment the parents have, of course, it's a challenge for
Yeah.
me, but some of it, and then the worshiping together as a family, which has been something we've always done since before COVID. It's been kind of, we've had they all started with their family, and then we left during the sermon time. We were doing kind of like you were talking about we did a fifth Sunday. Everybody worshiped together as family. So we're since COVID, because we needed extra seating in the sanctuary, we've been separate, and I do see just with my own third grader that's in there, that he never sets foot inside the main sanctuary. Yeah. So trying to figure out how we can get back to that, at least in some, because I think that's an important observation.
Yes. And by the way, I think anybody understands why during COVID, you've got limited space, you've had to make some adjustments, but you see the value in trying to move back and why. And I do appreciate too, coming in and having the worship with the parents and maybe stepping up for the sermon time is acceptable in terms of not conflicting with the principle here, but these do fit together, the serving together and the worshiping together. And so one thing I tell parents when I speak on this is that if you grow up in church, you're more than what's going to come across the text where Jesus is asked, which is the most important commandment? Of course, he says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So what happens when parents are serving, it shows their children, they're not just casual. They're not just a fan, but they're all in. Yep. They love Jesus with the heart, mind, soul, and strength. And when they worship, they see their parents listening to the sermon, not sleeping through it, and singing out. And if you're not giving to the offering plate, and at home, show your child, say, we give online. Here's how we do this every week. Let them see that you're invested in it. It does have an impression and is more likely to take root on that child. So that's why parents need to, we're not trying to lecture or get on the parents. We're trying to show them these are the things we've discovered that have a direct impact. There's no guarantees, but when you look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, these things made an impact on the likelihood they're going to be in church. So, and they're doable, so let's do these things.
Well, it's just part of the whole discipleship that we're called to make disciples of. It's the parents and the children. It's the whole.
That's right.
Generation.
There's no doubt when we looked at everything and at the end, we studied everything in clusters. We tried to put things together and see if they made a difference. And you'd have to see the chart, but it went way up about 7 things. But the number one thing, no doubt about it, when you combine strong marriage, parents serving the church, they worship together, balanced disciplinary style. In other words, those parent things were by far the most influential thing. And I'll say this, and Rick, we mentioned earlier about church struggling sometimes. we found when that happened, even if church had a struggle, there was such stability, in the home. It didn't shake them, they got through it. But you had struggles at home and struggles at church. Kids just get frustrated, say, well, forget about it.
Right.
All right. Rick, any question come to mind that you want, or do I need to rewind on something for you?
Yeah, I don't remember what. I know you mentioned this before in a meeting we had when you were here at the church one day, but what age would you recommend children being in the worship service?
Good question. I recommend at a minimum at third grade, they need to be in worship as much as possible. I mean, through the sermon and everything by third grade. I can, and by the way, this is my opinion, I can tolerate up to fifth grade, as long as they're into worship, but you've got to be in the worship sometime. And so I would also be okay with first grade and up. Now, if you're doing a situation where they're coming in for the first 30 minutes, 25 to 35 minutes, singing everything, it becomes less relevant. But especially if you've got a full-blown worship ministry, children's ministry experience through kindergarten, that's fine. After kindergarten, you need to be integrating them into the worship experience. That's when we saw that it made a difference. So first grade, third grade, fifth grade, probably the earlier the better up to first grade. But it is okay to have a hybrid where they're in there part of the time. Then they step out maybe during the offering together. I'll tell you something I did there, by the way. I was in a church and I took this issue also, that and the issue about the pastor. And so instead of them walking out during the offering, what we would do was this. I'd say, hey, boys and girls, it's time before we take our offering. You're about to go to children's worship. So while we're taking the offering, come down here and gather with me. And I want to pray with you before you go to your children's worship. So they'd already been there for all the songs and everything. So they're 20, 25 minutes in the service. We're taking up the offering. The boys and girls are coming and they're gathering around me. And I get down on my knees literally and just kind of huddle them around and praying over the microphone. People, I'm in the floor down there with the boys and girls. Just love, hey, I hope you have a great time. Thank you for being here with your mom and dad today. You have a great time in your message while I share mine. Pray for me. Let me pray for you. And it took about 90 seconds of our worship. So we're doing two things. They were in the worship. Then they were coming, they were connecting with me as pastor. Then they were getting a children's sermon. The adults were getting a sermon without as much distraction, without the boys and girls being in there, though. I'd rather have those distractions than the boys and girls be at home, of course, or not in worship. But here, a little anecdotal story again. I started doing this, and a few weeks later, I was in a Steak and Shake of all places after church one day. My wife and I, my daughter was sitting at a table, and a family came in. And they saw me and they looked kind of familiar. And this little 4-year-old girl just started running and grabbing me and just hugging on me. I'm thinking, who is it? Oh, they're from the church. She knew me. And see, you got to understand, for her, she's so concrete in her thinking, I'm not God, but to her, I'm God's representative. Mm-hmm. And it made that I took time to pray with her. Even at 4 and 5 years of age, making that huge of a difference. So there's ways around this, but to just totally separate out year in and year out, and then drop them in the sixth grade. And guess what happens in the sixth grade? They don't want to sit with their parents, which is normal, by the way. So we've got to get them in there prior to the sixth grade. We've got to get them in there third and fourth grade, fifth grade. So you pray about it, but just weigh this in, to the way you do things, and don't dismiss it, but don't go in and wreck everything next week either. Work through it with a plan that helps. Okay. Caroline, how about you? I know you probably heard me speak on this before, but is there a subject you want to rewind on for a minute here?
Just reading back through my notes. I think I had asked you at one of our other things about ways to get both parents involved in serving, because we have a lot of moms that are involved in serving, but it's harder to get the dads. And so I'm working on that. We're kind of rebuilding our volunteers, but trying to get some of them involved, even if the men, we've really, Craig's pushed hard with our deacons leaders recently about that they need to take responsibility, and the discipleship has to start with our kids. It's not just our adults. So I've got a couple they're actually grandfathers that have decided that they need to be involved in ministering some of these elementary school boys. But that's just, I guess, the only thing that I'm still just struggling with. I've got a few others that I'm talking to, can you be part of our greeting security team so that, we see your face and your kids see your face serving, but trying to find some creative ways to do that. So I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah. Let me reflect back on that. And there's maybe some things that I'd shared before, maybe some new things here. But one is give different levels of involvement. For example, if there's a man and he's just started coming to your church, or maybe he's a newer believer, or maybe he's just never served, and then ask him to commit a full year to work in the children's department, he's not ready for that. So find ways to involve people on different levels. For example, it may not mean, can you work somewhere for a year, but can you help us this weekend with something? Can you come in and sit in with a children's class? You don't need to do anything, just be there as an extra hand, a helping hand this month. And that's another thing you can do with Bible study groups also, have them rotate in once every 6 or 8 weeks, different couples to be helping hands. So you're not committing a full year, you're committing 1 week or one out of every 6 weeks or one every 8 weeks. And a lot of times a man or a woman who's less mature in their faith or less experienced, that may be more tolerable to give a hand. And what will happen as they do come in there and assist, and you do want to screen them, of course, they will grow a passion by being around the boys and girls and want to invest more time, but not just in your Bible study groups or your children's worship, but also just in other ways. And for example, just say, can you bring the ice? Somebody's got it. That's service, for some, that's a lot. Hey, the light bulbs are out. Can you change the light bulbs? Find a way to get people serving, because some people do not want to teach or don't feel qualified, but they can change light bulbs. Well, guess what? Somebody needs to change light bulbs. And by the way, Carolyn's husband's name is Craig. Craig's a pastor. Craig can change light bulbs. He's capable, but that's not a good use of his time, So find things people can do like that free up your time, or free up the time for your deacons, or free up the time for your Bible study leaders, that anybody can do. So find other ways to get people involved other than saying, hey, can you help us for a year? Find weekend things to do, daytime, and help. It's almost like you ever go swimming in a cold lake and you tiptoe in. Some people just dive in, some tiptoe in. So if you got guys who don't want to dive in, give them a way to tiptoe in the water a little bit at a time. That's one thing I'd say. Okay. Also, Caroline, don't be afraid to share this, and you can quote me and take, way you don't take the blame. So, hey, here's what I heard from Steve Parr, who's an expert on this. And I'm not saying I'm an expert, but the research we've done. And say, those whose parents serve and makes an impact, or when you give time, 721 years, it fills us up, with the leaders. Share that data with them also, because I have experience from being in churches, especially where I was serving as an interim for a more extended time, where I began to teach some of this. I've had men tell me, I started serving because of what you taught. I realized I was sitting back, I was laying back, and it was not healthy for my children for me to be laying back. So share this information and put it as you prepare Craig's sermons.
No, thanks.
But seriously, as he's preaching a sermon on the family, say, hey, Craig, see if you can throw this in there, and give him some data too, that while he's not listening to this, I know he's very sympathetic to what we're talking about today, because I know his heart. But he's busy himself, so share that with him, okay? Your pastor. All right, just open-ended now. Anything else here if we wrap this up, guys, you want to ask or share?
I will, just another anecdote, kind of like we were talking about the pastoral connection. I'll brag on Craig for just a minute, because we have a grandmother that has just joined the church, started watching online and has come, and she brought her granddaughter to the service with her, I think 2 weeks ago. And he's very gifted in going and just talking to people and stuff that as before service starts. And so she came back the next week and brought her parents. The little girl brought her parents, and it was because he had taken that time and talked, and they're a church family. It's not that they were unchurched, but just that time that he took, it just illustrates what you say so much, that he took those couple minutes, before the service started, just to engage in conversation. And it just really made an impact on that little girl. She's, I think, maybe first or second grade, enough to want to bring her parents to come to church. So
That's good, Caroline. And I'd say if you're watching this, and if your pastor could hear this, to a 7-year-old pastor, you're bigger than life. And when you pay attention and you bless them, you love on them, it really just makes an impact. And I think back to my childhood, and I had one pastor from 4th grade all the way through college. So I'd never thought about it until I did this research. Wow, the impact that likely had on me. And he was a giant to me. And now that I'm an adult, I'm bigger than he is, but I always just thought he was a giant of a man, and not just physically, but also just in his stature, spiritually. And I always knew he loved me. And so it made an impact in my life. Sure did.
Yeah,
Well, listen, thank you everyone for watching today. And I hope you enjoyed this. Please visit often our GwinnettMetro.net website, also steveparr.net. And if we can serve you in any way, please let us know. Thanks for your involvement, and thanks for listening as we shared about what keeps kids connected to church into their adult lives, especially for our children's leaders. And I hope to see you again soon.